Afternoon. Muy buenas tardes to all of my friends in Madrid who may be watching this either live or recorded. My name is Mark Asquino, and I'm going to be speaking about my memoir, Spanish Connections, my diplomatic journey from Venezuela to Equatorial Guinea today. A little bit by way of background, I had a 37-year career in the Foreign Service of the United States. And I spent that time in Latin America first, followed by time in Europe, then in Central Asia, and finally in Africa. I entered the Foreign Service, as I write in the book, through a Spanish connection at the University of Oviedo in Asturias, where I was a Fulbright professor teaching American literature and American history. And I met some people from the U.S. Embassy who said, "Gee, you would be a good diplomat." So I took the Foreign Service test and passed it and had a career that lasted from 1978 until 2015 when I retired. A number of my posts, indeed, were in Spanish speaking places. They included Venezuela, Panama, Spain, Chile, and Equatorial Guinea. And I also served in Romania and Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Sudan. I write in the book's introduction that this is a memoir about my diplomatic journey to Equatorial Guinea, a small, ill fated Spanish speaking country in Africa. In it, I discuss the many stops along the way that finally led to my serving as U.S. ambassador to Spain's only former colony in sub Saharan Africa. This is a story about a lifelong fascination with Spain that began with a strange tale my mother told me about a mysterious uncle who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. My assignment to Equatorial Guinea was the last piece needed to complete a full circle in my professional life that began in Franco Spain. Well, certainly Spain and Spanish speaking places are the central themes of my memoir. But for today's talk, given the broad foreign policy interests of this group, um, I am going to take a slightly different focus. I'm going to talk about what it is like to be an American diplomat in foreign dictatorships or in countries that have less than democratic forms of government. In fact, I could just as easily have called my memoir Authoritarian Connections, but I don't think that's a particularly good title. However, given that focus, I think not bad for this talk. Um, well, five of the countries where I served, starting with Panama, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Sudan, and of course, finally, Equatorial Guinea, were absolute authoritarian countries. As for Romania, after 24 years of communist rule under Nicolae Ceausescu, the Iliescu government that followed his overthrow was proto-democratic with strong authoritarian connections. Spain, of course, after Franco, and Chile, post Pinochet, were evolving democracies. And oddly enough, given its present sad state, Venezuela in 1979-80, when I served there, was the only stable democracy that I would have a chance to serve in. Uh, Now, of course, in a 45-minute presentation, I can't talk about serving in all of those countries, but I'll touch on a few of them, and I'll talk about what I found was challenging in representing U.S. foreign policy in them. Um, Let me start with Panama, my second tour, 1980, 1982. There I was the assistant press attaché in the public affairs section. I'd never lived in an authoritarian country, and so Panama was quite a new experience for me. General Omar Torrijos was the commander of the Panamanian National Guard and served as the country's military strongman from 1968 until his death in 1981. And while Torrijos was never officially the president of Panama, he'd come to power through a military coup and clearly ruled as an autocratic ruler. Torrijos was best known for having negotiated the 1977 Torrijos-Carter treaties, which returned the Panama Canal to Panama. In 1999, the year before I arrived, Panama had begun to assume full sovereignty over the Panama Canal. Uh, well, in the lead up to the treaty, uh, excuse me, sorry, I'm back. There had been a need for two press officers. That was because the negotiations themselves and the implementation attracted worldwide attention. But by 1980, things had returned to a fairly normal status. Panama was less focused on at that point. So there really was no need for two press officers. A little bit about how I entered the Foreign Service. I came in as a diplomat with the U.S. Information Agency, small organization founded in 1953 to counter Soviet propaganda. Its focus was on information, education, and cultural exchange. And so, as a junior officer, I wasn't doing full time press work. I did a little bit of all of those things during my 2 year assignment. But things would change dramatically, if only briefly, midway through my tour. Every U.S. embassy has a duty officer, and this person, who serves on a rotating basis throughout the embassy, is there after hours during weekdays. He or she is serving during weekends. And the job is initially to respond to any problems, crises that might occur at the embassy. Well, it turned out that I was the embassy duty officer on August 1st, 1981. It was a Saturday, and I received a report that General Torrijos's aircraft had crashed in a remote part of Panama, and that he and everyone else on the plane had died. The ambassador and senior embassy officers were out of town. It was a beautiful August weekend, uh, quiet time, supposedly. But after that report, the deputy chief of mission and I sent a what is called a flash cable to Washington, to State Department, to let them know what had happened, and also the reaction we were seeing initially in Panama about Torrijos's death. Um, we worked at the time with White House Press Special Assistant Hamilton Jordan in the Carter administration. And we worked together on the wording of a statement in response to the general's death. It was an exciting time for a young diplomat. Our relationship with Panama was a complicated one. We helped to bring about its independence in 1903 in the Teddy Roosevelt administration through gunboat diplomacy, forcing Colombia to give Panama sovereignty. We worked on building the canal from 1904 to 1914. And to run the canal, we established something called the Panama Canal Zone. This was 5 miles wide across the isthmus. It was declared sovereign U.S. territory. And over the decades, the Panamanians re- resented this because they felt they were being colonized. There were violent demonstrations in 1964 against the U.S. presence, and eventually in 1977, President Jimmy Carter negotiated a return of the canal. So, complicated relationship. And it was for that reason that the U.S. Embassy got a flood of press calls, and I fielded those. And all of the journalists wanted to know the same thing. They asked me, what will happen now that Torrijos is gone? Who is going to be running Panama? And this was fascinating for me because I learned firsthand really just how unstable one man rule can be in an authoritarian country when a leader suddenly disappears. Well, it wasn't the president of Panama who was a figurehead, nor the parliament, which was a rubber stamp, that stepped in after Torrijos' death. It was the military, not surprisingly, and they found someone on an interim basis who ran the country until another strong man emerged, General Manuel Noriega. Well, Torrijos' death generated an enormous amount of international press interest, and there were all sorts of unsubstantiated rumors that there had been an assassination plot against him. And in 1981, this was still during the Cold War, and the Soviet news agency TASS immediately claimed the U.S. had orchestrated Torrijos' death. Well, that wasn't true, and I was authorized by Washington to deny in the strongest terms that this was false. And so this experience was fascinating, but I returned to my normal job after the weekend. And what I learned was that the US is often implicated, rightly or wrongly, when dictators die mysteriously. And that, among other things, was quite a valuable lesson, which served me well throughout my career. So at this point, I would like to fast forward a decade to April 1991 when I arrived in Bucharest, Romania, as the embassy's cultural affairs officer. Uh, 2 years earlier, in December 1989, President Nicolae Ceausescu had been overthrown and executed in the last of a series of anti communist uprisings in Central and Eastern Europe. And you might recall that period. Some of the countries emerged from communism quite smoothly. There was the Velvet Revolution for Czechoslovakia at the time. The wall came down in East Germany. Other countries moved rather smoothly. Not the case. In Romania, there was really a violent clash. Ceausescu eventually fled, was captured, was executed. Some people said it was not really a democratic revolution, it was more like a palace coup. So the situation was very different. There were countries like Hungary and Czech Republic afterwards, and Slovakia, uh, Poland, that were part of what was called the Visegrad group. And they were viewed as moving quite well towards democracy. But Romania, Bulgaria, and certainly Albania were not. And so our policy there in those countries was much more focused on assisting with democracy. Getting back to Ceausescu, he had become general secretary of the Communist Party in 1965, declared himself head of state 2 years later. His rule was characterized by brutal and often erratic rule of his people. I arrived at a time of political and economic uncertainty. Following Ceausescu's overthrow, Ion Iliescu, former member of Ceausescu's communist government, had emerged. He had been sidelined, pushed aside by Ceausescu, but he gained prominence as a member of a new National Salvation Front party. Despite Iliescu's past ties to Ceausescu, he claimed, along with other members of this coalition, that he was for multi-party democracy, free market principles in Romania. But in a matter of weeks, after the NSF established a provisional government, Iliescu was its head. There were protests in Bucharest. Mostly young people charged the party was led by former insiders, especially Iliescu, who had no commitment to democracy. And they were largely right about that. In many ways, Iliescu's government was viewed as neo-communist. It was certainly the way we viewed it from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. Uh, the protesters filled a square near the embassy. They said that Ceausescu's Securitate, which was the much feared national security agency, continued to operate as a force of repression. And during the 3 years I spent in Romania, indeed, I was very much aware that my phone was always tapped by the Securitate, and that occasionally was followed by its agents. Well, going back to the spring of 1990, in the elections, Iliescu, whose party controlled the media at the time, won 85% of the vote. And the National Salvation Front won two-thirds of the seats in Parliament. Not surprisingly, the protesters rejected the election results as fraudulent, although the international community, including the United States, deemed them as free and fair. The democratic opposition parties in Romania were divided. Their members mistrusted each other, making it difficult for them to challenge Iliescu. And sadly, this was a legacy of Ceausescu's long rule dictatorship. Uh, Ordinary citizens during that time were co-opted by the Securitate, which is what happened with the Stasi in East Germany. People spied on each other, reported. I'll never forget a conversation that I had with the rector of a provincial university. He was someone that the embassy viewed as pro-Western and a modernizer, despite his connections with the Ceausescu regime. We took a long walk one day after my having lunch at his home, and he said to me, Mr. Asquino, sometimes you Americans judge us harshly. You don't understand our situation under Ceausescu. And then he said in a low voice, imagine if you had a sick child who desperately needed scarce medicine to survive. You're frantic because you had no way to obtain it. And then one day, someone from the government approached you. He had the medicine that your child needed and said he would be happy to give it to you. But then he added, you have to do something for me in return. What would you do? Would you refuse and let your child die? Well, I replied, I didn't have children, and despite that, I clearly understood what a terrible moral dilemma was that he had presented. And I thought to myself, well, in such circumstances, I'd do anything to save my child. I'd agree to be an informer. I'd do anything, maybe even worse. After he saw me think about this, he smiled sardonically and said, well, Mr. Asquino, that's the sort of situation we found ourselves in all the time. It was tantamount to an admission on his part that he had been co-opted in the past and forced to report to the Securitate on his dealings with Americans. I respected him tremendously for his courage in telling me this, and I thought it's quite possible that he's still reporting. And in that sense, I took it as a warning, and I was careful with what I said to him and others. But most of the time, it was just the opposite. Most Romanians I met would say they wanted to tell me about how much they opposed Ceausescu and suffered under communism. What was really funny was that these statements were made in their home, where they had luxuries that would have only been possible for people who were close to the Ceausescu regime. Well, what this taught me was that when it came to judging people's sincerity and past allegiances, there was little black or white in Romania. Indeed, most people had been tarnished for a variety of reasons, some quite understandable, as in the case of the rector, while others less honorable. I learned to navigate my way through the pervasive shades of gray that dominated almost every aspect of my personal and professional life in Romania. And I avoided those people who protested too much about how much they'd suffered under Ceausescu. I was the embassy official overseeing educational and other exchange resources. And I felt I was able to accomplish a great deal in those years. This was because foreign policy under the George H.W. Bush administration saw a window of opportunity in the fall of communism in East and Central Europe. And accordingly, there were a number of new people to people programs and expansion of old ones. For example, there was a program called Support for Eastern European Democracy, where we had money for special university linkages, exchanges of professors. We had a program called Flex, Future Leader Exchange that sent high school kids for a year to the United States to study at a U.S. high school. And we had programs under the American Bar Association's Central and Eastern European Leadership Initiative that sent us judges and prosecutors to work with their counterparts on rule of law. I also, through the Fulbright program, had professors who taught Western journalism, free market economics, and rule of law, and worked closely with the U.S. Agency on International Development on economic assistance. The focus of our policy really was on democratization and opening the society, creating civil society. And even though we didn't fully accomplish that during my time, I think a lot of the things we did had benefit to what now is a genuinely democratic Romania. At the time when I was in Romania, the Peace Corps volunteers arrived. This was the first time. And in fact, I met and I courted and eventually married a Peace Corps volunteer, which is a very happy memory for me. But returning to my topic, what I learned was that in authoritarian societies and successor states, things are never quite what they seem. There are lots of people out there in government and elsewhere who are constantly trying to deceive and entrap you. And that to be a successful diplomat, you must navigate your way through pervasive and sometimes very treacherous shades of gray that dominate such places. Well, that experience was invaluable to me in assignments afterwards in Central Asia, in Sudan, and especially in Equatorial Guinea, where I was U.S. ambassador. And that's a country that I would like to talk with you about right now. Equatorial Guinea, first of all, is in central West Africa. It has borders of Cameroon and Gabon, also not far from Nigeria. And what I write in the very beginning of my memoir is the following. What was I doing accepting the Order of the Grand Cross of Independence of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea from Africa's longest serving dictator? That's a question I've often asked myself about that memorable day in September 2015, which was one of my last as an American diplomat. Well, I write in the book that for any American ambassador, and certainly one about to retire, receiving the host country's highest honor is something very special. But it's a rather different story when you're in a country like Equatorial Guinea. What became Spanish Guinea in West Central Africa had been ceded by Portugal to Spain in 1778 after close to 2 centuries of harsh dictatorial colonial rule. The newly named Republic of Equatorial Guinea was reluctantly granted independence by Generalissimo Franco in 1968. The country's first president was a minor colonial functionary named Francisco Macias Guema, who was chosen through elections that were deemed free and fair by the United Nations and others. But what followed under Macias was an 11-year reign of terror that combined the worst elements of Idi Amin's and Pol Pot's savage rule with the Spanish dasks of Franco's Spain. In 1979, Macias was overthrown in a military coup directed by his nephew, then Lieutenant Colonel Teodoro Obiang Guema Basso, who had served as one of Macias's most brutal henchmen. And Obiang has ruled the country ever since with an iron fist. He's won multiple rigged elections during that time, used repression to stay in power. And at the end of my term, 2015, on very short notice, this was the very man who was giving me this impressive looking medal. Well, the tremendous irony about this is that during my 2012-2015 tenure, key elements of the Obama administration's foreign policy stressed the promotion of democracy and call for protection of human rights. Indeed, during my congressional hearing before the Senate to be confirmed as an ambassador, I'd spoken about working to promote democracy and human rights, to support U.S. investment in the country, and also about security in the Gulf of Guinea. Those are all the key areas that I worked. And on those first few, I spent a lot of time urging the Obiang regime to release unjustly imprisoned political opposition leaders. I criticized it for the absence of free media and other basic rights for its citizens. And I insisted, both in public and in private, I was not an advocate for any political party, but rather was in favor of democratic principles, including respect for human rights and opening political space to opposition parties. Well, in response, at least initially, regime officials made it very clear to me they were not happy that I was the U.S. ambassador, although over time, we basically found some common ground on which to work. I can't go into everything today on what happened during those 3 momentous years. About a third of the memoir actually is about Equatorial Guinea. But I will say that there were times when the government accused the United States and me personally of any number of falsehoods. And given my experience in other dictatorships, including Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Sudan, I never took these attacks personally. I answered in ways I felt supported our policy. I knew, in fact, that the government of Equatorial Guinea had any number of nefarious people. Just as in other dictatorships, I had to work with them, as I mentioned, to find common ground if I were ever to accomplish anything. As in Romania, there was a fair amount of gray with situations, never being quite as black or white as they might seem. Well, after all of those years in authoritarian countries, I recognized at the end of my career that perhaps my greatest skill as a diplomat was being a chameleon. but not in a pejorative sense. I learned long ago to adapt to morally ambiguous situations. I was good at engaging with people who had values conflicting with those I held dear, as well as with others with whom I shared values. I could appear as a friend and ally to both without ever fully satisfying either. While never losing a sense of my inner values, I was often perceived to be whatever different people thought they saw in me. That was how I felt on that day when I received the Order of the Grand Cross of Independence of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. And this brings me to a final question for this talk that several of my non diplomat friends often ask. How could you have possibly been a diplomat in terrible places like Equatorial Guinea and all of those other authoritarian countries where you served? Well, a number of answers to that question. First of all, diplomats only have a limited ability in terms of where they are sent. So that's one aspect. All of us enter the Foreign Service agreeing that we will be worldwide available for assignments. And so it's expected that not only serve in nice countries like Spain and Chile, but also difficult and dangerous ones, including those with repressive governments. In Equatorial Guinea and the other authoritarian places I was posted, my greatest challenge was making sure that whatever the circumstance, I kept a firm grasp on my personal moral compass. When you enter the Foreign Service, you don't sign away your conscience or your obligations to speak up, albeit diplomatically in foreign countries and also with your own government. That's never easy, but it's absolutely necessary. Doing so for me was the real capstone of my career and not receiving some medal. So with that, I will open this session to questions that you might have. Happy to answer as well as I can. So Paco, I think, and Carlos, you were going to send me questions. I hope this broadcast got through to everybody. Please let me know. Okay, I see that there is a comment from Paco about a flash cable. And that indeed is a very quick response. In embassies, normally cables are more of a deliberative process. We wind up spending time doing analysis. But what one finds in situations like what happened with Torrijos was that you just have to get the information there. And a flash cable means if people are asleep in Washington, you wake them up and you tell them. And then you follow up with phone calls and you let them know the immediate reaction. And over time, we did write very detailed cables on what was happening, the media reaction, which was something that I would do as an assistant press officer. So that's really the balance to address your question. I think in my 37-year career, that that was the only flash cable that I ever helped write. But it was a valid one, I felt, and an important one. So anyway, thanks for the question. Don't know whether there are others. I'm here on board. Very pleasant, nice day here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and happy to answer your questions. And I also really want to thank the Grupo uh, for inviting me today to speak with you. I think they're doing very important work on relations across the world. We'll be traveling to Spain in late September, October. Perhaps I'll have a chance to meet some of you and we can talk some more. But have enjoyed having this chat with you. Um, okay, let's see. I see there is another question. Yeah, this is a very good one on navigating the narrow line between pleasing a dictator and simultaneously engaging. And I found that to be particularly important in my time in Equatorial Guinea. Um, this is a regime in power for an enormous amount of time. When I approached them, I often had very tough messages, but I delivered them in a way that was respectful, that was clear. I talked about why it was important to maintaining the strength of our bilateral relationship when they were doing things like falsely charging people in the opposition. Um, and I listened to what they said. That was the most important thing. I knew at times I was going to annoy them. During my first year, they actually threatened to declare me persona non grata, to throw me out of the country. But I did what I had to in terms of US foreign policy. And I actually think that they gave me the Order of Independence, the Grand Cross of Equatorial Guinea, because I was an honest interlocutor with them. I didn't lie to them ever. I didn't promise them anything I couldn't deliver. And I think at the end of the day, they respected that, even though I told them things they did not like. So that is what you have to do sometimes. And I never shied away from meeting with the opposition. I knew that they were unhappy about that. But that was my job as well. I mean, if you're trying to support multi-party democracy, you can't just spend time with the ruling party. You have to meet with people in the opposition. And that was important for me to do. And I enjoyed working with those people. I admire their courage. They were often harassed, sometimes jailed by the government, but they are still there working day to day on trying to achieve democracy in Equatorial Guinea, for which I have enormous admiration. Okay, well, I think I answered that one. I tried. Let's see. Did I get anything else in the in the little box here? Here is a question about my time as a Fulbrighter in Oviedo in 1975. And it indeed is a very, very good question. When Franco died, of course, the universities throughout the country were closed. And there was an official period of mourning after his death. And so I could no longer teach my classes, nor could my British colleague. And he decided, so that our students wouldn't suffer, that he would teach classes in his home on a voluntary basis for his students. He was teaching English language, whereas I was teaching American literature and history. And I decided to do the same thing. And I had a number of students come. Others said they wanted to attend, but it was a very uncertain time in Spain after Franco died. Again, as in authoritarian societies, as I mentioned, it's very unstable when the dictator leaves, dies. And I taught those courses and I was quite happy. And one day, my British colleague came and said, I'm not teaching my classes anymore. And I said, Peter, why not? And he said, because someone I know connected with security, and we used to call those police back then, they wore gray uniforms, los grises. Someone in los grises said, you and your colleague are doing something that is offensive after the death of General Franco. And if you don't stop, something might happen to you. And I thought about that. And I, for the first time in my life, experienced a sense of no one can protect me. I am hundreds of miles away from the US Embassy in Madrid. Uh, no one is going to come forward. And I have to negotiate the reality of the situation. But it told me just how strong the dictatorship continued after Franco's death, that we were being threatened. And I never forgot that. So that was, I would say, certainly the most shocking situation I had in Oviedo in 1975. But I learned something from it, that there are times when you have to be very careful when you're in a foreign country, particularly in that case. I was not a diplomat. I had no diplomatic immunity. I was just a private US citizen with an American grant. Okay, this is the last question from Edward Said. Uh, Actually, not from him, but quoting him. Western mistakes when trying to understand other cultures. Is it possible to escape from that trap? Did you experience that when serving in Asian or African countries? Again, that is an excellent question. I think one of the things you do, have to do before you go to a country, particularly one that you don't have a lot of context on, is to learn as much as you can through reading books, through meeting people from the country. In the case of Central Asia, I learned Russian. That was the lingua franca of the countries at the time, but they were all switching to their own languages too. But they dealt with me in Russian, and I spent a lot of time looking at Soviet period when Central Asia was part of the Soviet Union, trying to understand that, learn that, get a sense of that. And that helped me a great deal. Even when I was speaking Russian sometime, which I was never completely fluent in, but it helped me sometimes even the language itself of understanding how it functions when I was talking with Central Asians. In Africa, it was really interesting because I was an old white man in that culture. And in the case of Equatorial Guinea, they had had hundreds of years of old white men, old Spaniards, telling them what to do and how they should act. So I spent a lot of time learning about the culture of the different tribes in Equatorial Guinea, the Fang minority, the Bubi, minority, Fang majority, sorry, and trying to understand that. And when I sat down with the government leadership, I come back to what I said earlier. I was always very respectful. I understood that I was not there to dictate to them what they should do. I was there to talk about their bilateral relationship with the United States, what we thought was important, why democracy, even the fact that it is not perfect, certainly in our own country, the United States, but why democratic values are important and why, in the end, they create far more stable, prosperous, and happy societies. They didn't agree with me, but I sometimes was able to show that it was in their self-interest to do things. They were very image conscious. And when they did things, once they imprisoned a bunch of school children who had thrown rocks against the leading party or the ruling party's headquarters. That was in international media. That was online. They looked terrible. And that was something that they had to realize in any society was not acceptable to put young children in prison. Maybe you say you were delinquent, you did something you shouldn't have, but to treat them like criminals was the wrong thing to do. So I think that in the end, that was what I was able to do. And it was a learning experience. And I was enormously grateful that I was able to serve in some of those countries because they helped me to grow, both as a person and a diplomat. And I had a wonderful diplomatic career. So once again, I thank the Grupo Histórica for sponsoring this discussion today. Hope to have an occasion, perhaps, to come back, talk about something else in the near future, and particularly want to thank my good friend, Professor Rodríguez Fernandez, for setting this up, and also to Carlos for being one of the people who allowed me to do this. Thank you all very much.